Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and excited to tell you that the Codist is back in print. The second edition is now released and available both in Kindle and paperback. You can find it online at Amazon.com, and I encourage you to get a hold of it. It is the story of the weaponization of DNA. A particular strand of DNA, the Levites, the Levitical line, the ones that have to form the Sanhedrin to call for the return of Jesus. Satan has found a way to get you to give your DNA, to go out there and get tested. What do you think is going on in Tehran right now at the Tehran Genetics Institute? They're looking for a way to weaponize that DNA. Read all about it in the book, The Codist, and then go to ignitinganation.com, scroll to the bottom of the page, and put in your email address and get the first chapter of my latest book, The 7 Laws of Abundant Living, Lessons Learned from the Tree of Life, where God uses the things of the natural to reveal supernatural truth. We'll give you the first chapter for free. Today we're talking with two authors who have merged together to come up with an incredible, and when I mean incredible, I'm talking about for 95% of our audience that is uncomfortable in preaching the gospel. They have created the Gospel Fluency Handbook, a practical guide to speaking the truth of Jesus into the everyday stuff of life. Jeff Vanderstelt and Ben Connelly. Jeff is the visionary of the Soma family of churches and Saturate, and the lead teaching pastor at Doxa Church in Bellevue, Washington. He gets to spend his days doing what he loves, training disciples of Jesus to make more disciples of Jesus, and equipping the church in the gospel and missional living. Vanderstelt is the author of Gospel Fluency, Saturate, and the Saturate Field Guide. He and his wife Jane have 3 children, live in Seattle, Washington area, and you can learn more about Jeff at jeffvanderstelt.com or saturatetheworld.com. He's also actually active on Facebook at Saturate the World and on Twitter at Saturate the World. Ben Connelly started and now co-pastors the City Church, part of the Acts 29 network and Soma family of churches. He also directs church planting for Soma churches across North America and has taught university classes. With degrees from Baylor and Dallas Theological Seminary, he writes for various publications and does training across the country. He's published a few books, including co-authoring Saturate Field Guide and Gospel Fluency Handbook. He and his wife Jess have 3 children, live in Fort Worth, Texas. He blogs occasionally at benconnelly.net, and he's on Twitter as @ConnellyBen. Jeff and Ben, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having us.
You're welcome. Listen, this is kind of 3 guys sitting around a cup of coffee, and if you got something to chime in and it seems like you're cutting one another off, it's okay. Right? You're in 2 different parts of the world. One of you is in Texas, one of you is in Washington, and one of us is in Birmingham, Alabama. And this is the wonders of modern technology that brings us together. But I'm going to start out with Jeff. Jeff, give me a little bit of your journey. You're a visionary. And in order to be a visionary, the vision comes from God. Was that something that, as a little kid, you grabbed a hold of, your family implanted in you, or is this something you came to realize college? When was your real 2 Corinthians 5:17 experience?
Yeah, so I grew up in a home where my parents were believers, and they brought us up in the church. I had always been an explorer, always thinking through what's the next thing, challenged everything in front of me all my life, but didn't really come to faith in Jesus Christ till I was 21, and was thankful to grow up in a household where my parents had a very open household where people were regularly in our home. They exercised hospitality. We're not ashamed to talk about Jesus openly, but I kind of learned how to live a dual life, pretending to be the good Christian kid when really I was just ashamed, living in fear of man. And it wasn't until I was 21 where Jesus really broke in and woke me up, and the Spirit of God granted me regeneration to where I could really see for the first time how amazing Jesus was, realized my need for his saving work, and surrendered my life to him. And it was shortly after that that God made it very clear to me I was supposed to begin to teach and disciple kids. So my first 14 years of engaging in some form of ministry was in youth ministry, and continued to teach kids the gospel, middle school and high school kids, train them how to be disciples who could make disciples. And I saw them do active, effective ministry to their peers, but then I would see them graduate into what they often called big church. And what that usually led to was they were encouraged to take a seat and invite their friends to somebody else doing the ministry for them, and continued to be disillusioned by that reality, to the point at which I decided we should maybe start some churches that take very seriously equipping the saints for ministry in all of life, which led to me planting the church that's called Soma in Tacoma, Washington. And that led to the family of churches, which is around North America. And the vision that God had given me is, what if we could equip everyday normal people to be gospel ministers where they live, work, learn, and play, so that we could see gospel saturation happen in North America. And that's really what I've devoted my life to, is truly equipping the saints for the work of ministry and not just inviting them to attend a church service only.
Now, you talk about you wore a mask. You acted the part, you smiled, you raised your hand when your hands were supposed to be raised, you clapped when you're supposed to clap, but you did it out of obedience because it was what you were supposed to do, but your mind was somewhere else, your heart and intent was somewhere else. What happened at 21? What was that encounter? Was it with a person? Was it with a she, which oftentimes it is a she? How did that happen? How did that come to you that you would have such a transformation at 21?
Well, I think it's important to set it up appropriately, and that is that early on in my life, I bought into this idea that what's most important is what people think of me. There was a lot of shame-based motivation in the church that I grew up in, and so I learned this. I think I strategically learned how to play the part to be accepted in church so that I wouldn't be shamed publicly, and to be accepted at school so I wouldn't be shamed publicly. So at church, I appeared to be a great Christian, and at school, I appeared to be the most popular, athletic, intelligent party animal you can imagine. So it's like all of that, so I could live in every place and be a chameleon. When I was 21, I was living in Spain, going to school as part of my education in college, doing overseas studies, and living in the home of an older woman who loved Jesus, and her son was the pastor of the Baptist church. And God, of course, divinely and appropriately put me in a place where I couldn't avoid Jesus anymore, with a woman who was the real deal, like just loved Jesus like crazy. And I had just come off from a very difficult breakup, so there was a girl involved, but it was on the other side of her having cheated on me with my best friend. We were looking to get married. I found her with my best friend, destroyed the whole relationship. A few weeks later, I moved to Spain for school, with all that pain, all that heartbreak. And I just don't know what to do with everything that's fallen apart in my life. But then I happened to be in the household with this older, godly woman who prays for me every single day. And one night I came home, was in my bedroom, opened up my Bible, which my mom had taught me to do. So I almost religiously read my Bible, even if it was in a drunken state. I just did it no matter what. And with this night I was sober, opened the Word. As soon as I opened it, began to pray, I heard, for the very first time in my life, I heard God speak to me, and not in an audible way, but in a very clear way. And what I heard him say is, Jeff, when you were a kid, you came forward at a call and you said you gave your life to me, but you never gave me your life. You gave me your afterlife. You were afraid about hell, but you weren't ready to give me your life to live for me today. So I want your life. I don't just want your afterlife. I want your life now. And so I got on my knees and said, Jesus, I believe you died for my sins. I believe that what you did was sufficient to cleanse me of all that I've done that's been disobedient and ungodly. And I accept you not only for what you've done for me, but I want to be submitted to you as my Lord, and I want to do whatever you tell me to do. I don't know what that is, but you're going to have to tell me. And it was 2 weeks after that, I got a letter from a Christian camp in Pennsylvania called Summer's Best 2 Weeks. They said, we heard about you and heard that you might be a good camp counselor for us. And it happened to be a sports camp, and I played college sports, so they knew of me that way somehow. And I thought, well, if I can get a letter in Spain from a camp in Pennsylvania asking me to be a counselor at a Christian camp, maybe that's what God's asking me to do next. So I just figured, I asked him to show me what to do. Seems like that's what he wants me to do. Came home, got off the plane, met my parents in the airport. My mom's first thing that she said to me after she hugged me was, "What happened to you? You're not the same person." And I told them how Jesus had changed my life and how I was now going to go serve him at this camp all summer. And from that point on, it was clear God had called me, gifted me, set me apart for preaching the gospel, making disciples, and really the rest is history from that point on.
If I could explode right now, I would, because this has been my challenge to every believer. If when people encounter you after not seeing you for a while, they cannot see something different about you, right, then you have not been transformed. It is noticeable, it's palpable, it does change you, it makes you different, and it needs to be a goal that I be more conformed and more transformed into the image of Messiah, that someone would see me and say, there's something different about you, and it's recognizable. And I think we're called for that to happen, because we cannot be the transformers of the world by just speaking it. We have to do it by being it. So Ben,
yes, sir.
did you know all about this renegade guy who was traveling the world and living this dual life as I believe, but forgive my unbelief, kind of wearing the mask of one foot in each camp? Did you know that about this guy?
Yeah, I knew a little bit of Jeff's story, and I know the profile of Jeff's story because my story is somewhat very similar, and so I recognize some of my own stories. Jeff retells his a little bit here.
All right. So what is your story?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Texas, and so I don't know how long you've been in Alabama, Eric, but you know the deep Southern religious roots are firmly planted in the ground here as much as they are in Alabama, and so grew up in a very religious family. Was quote unquote, or thought that I was quote unquote saved at age 8 or so. Nothing spectacular. I didn't, go flush drugs down the toilet because at age 8 I wasn't doing drugs or anything like that. But yeah, I thought I understood what Jesus meant. And then lived a generally good, kind of moralistic, again, very Texas religious life. And became a youth pastor at age 18 even. And it was about 2 years into youth pastoring, while at the same time being at university and living somewhat of a stereotypical freshman and sophomore year life that you would see or assume on freshmen and sophomores in America. And so there again, I resonate with Jeff's story of living the dual life. I was paid to teach kids about Jesus and train them up in kind of right living. And then I would go do things that I taught them not to do for a couple of years. And I certainly don't say that to my pride. I'm grateful for the forgiveness of Jesus, or through Jesus. Because at age 20, something clicked in a similar way to Jeff. And it was after a particularly dark and depraved day that I realized if I say that I believe in Jesus, then shouldn't he matter to all of life? Shouldn't he actually matter to the way that I live? And so to your point, Eric, a moment ago, if there's this proclamation of a faith that doesn't have any fruit to it, or if there's a proclamation of faith that doesn't have any kind of display of the change, the transformation that Jesus made, I lived that for a number of years. I lived saying that Jesus made a difference without actually feeling or knowing or displaying any difference that he made. And so at age 20, that seemingly basic but startling realization that if Jesus is real, he should matter to all of life, is what I would say is I don't know if I was actually redeemed then. I don't know if I was actually redeemed at 8. I don't think it really matters. I know it became real and actually started to make an impact for me when I was 20.
And Pastor Jack Hayford looked at me one day and he pointed his finger at me and he said, if worship hasn't changed you, you haven't worshiped.
Mm.
If an encounter with Jesus hasn't changed you, you have not encountered Jesus. You cannot be the same. And
Sure.
I began to passionately question and said, if we were created to worship, how come nobody's teaching people how to worship? And so I began a 2-month series where I took my entire congregation from the pulpit and I changed the entire order of the service, where it used to be the welcome, then praise, then some announcements and some liturgical stuff because I was Jewish and Messianic, and then we would have the worship set and then the message, and I changed it all and had worship after the message so you could apply the worship message, and thought, wow, I wonder why we don't preach the message first and then give people the opportunity to apply the message. Like, I don't know, service. Why don't we preach a message on hospitality and then have every other row serve every other row and play it out and say, wow, that's a really odd model but doesn't that make more sense? Because if you're not going to apply it right after you heard it, okay, you're certainly not going to apply it 3 days later or a month later. You're just going to lose it. How many times have you heard, wow, best message I ever heard? Well, what was it? I don't know, but I can just tell you it was the best message I ever heard.
Yeah.
So how did you two connect?
Yeah, I'll take this one, Jeff. I was working on planting a church in Fort Worth, Texas. I was going through a master's degree and reading the scriptures, writing papers on the scriptures. Again, I worked through the Bible several times growing up, but to the point we've been talking about, God had given me new eyes to see truly kind of what the scriptures meant and how the church lived. And so I was doing this at school, and then I was working for a church still, now as a Christian, which is probably a good mark for someone working in the church, that I failed on for a couple of years of my ministry life. But I felt like I was getting paid to do something very different than what I saw the church doing in the scriptures. And I was working with university students primarily. And we stopped kind of bringing them off campus and started to leave them on campus and started to equip them to make disciples. And God started producing fruit through that. And so we had this idea for a church that tried to do the same, actually love our neighbors and seek the welfare of our cities and our neighborhoods and this kind of stuff. Because if college kids will do it as stereotypically the most transient and most selfish generation of Americans, surely people who have a vested interest in their neighborhood would do the same. And so I wrote this idea for what a church could look like doing that. It wasn't something that I had seen as we were working on it, at least in Fort Worth, Texas. And one of my seminary professors who I gave this kind of idea to said, oh, there's this church in Washington that's been doing this for 5 or 6 years now. They're called Soma. And so I looked them up and found Soma, and at that point they were bringing folks in who were interested in doing ministry in this way and starting churches. And so I flew to Tacoma, Washington, and spent a week immersed in the lifestyle of that church that Jeff was leading. And that's how I found Soma. That's how I found Jeff.
Well, that's thank you both for sharing that story, because our intention in the first segment of this program is for our audience just to get to know you. Mm-hmm. Can I relate to you? All right. Yeah. Long before we talk about a book or a product, or do I relate to your story? Was I that 21-year-old? Was I that 44-year-old? Mm-hmm. I was a pretty good Jew. according to, the Jewish checklist of what makes a good Jew.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity has the same one.
That's right.
What's the checklist? Did I attend? Did I do this? Did I do that? We have checklist Christianity. We have checklist Judaism. But what was missing from my life was relationship with the Lord and a depth of understanding. The Gospel Fluency Handbook is a product of the gospel, the book Gospel Fluency. So there's actually a book, and then there's a handbook. And we're going to talk about the handbook when we come back from break, and how to apply some of this, and whether or not you need to go out and first read a book. There's some people who are applied learners, and this is the tool for them. There's others that are contemplative learners, and the book Gospel Fluency is for them, because if they don't feel like they've built the house, then they can't furnish the house. This is the furniture and the interior decorating of the house you build with Gospel Fluency. So we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the principles of this Gospel Fluency Handbook, how to speak the truth of Jesus in everyday life. I can tell you 100% of all Christians are trying to figure out a way to get the message across, but they're either uncomfortable, they're unnatural, they don't know what the right setting is, they don't know how to take control of the setting, and then there's people like me that see signs that says Jesus saves, and all I want to do is say, what's the big deal? If it said Jesus invests, I might be able to pay attention to that, but that's a story for another time. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with Ben Connelly and Jeff Vanderstelt, authors of Gospel Fluency and the Gospel Fluency Handbook. We'll be right back. Shalom. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, Executive Director of Igniting a Nation and host of the daily TV program Revealing the Truth, seen live every Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time at www.ianbn.com, and then replayed throughout the day and night via our website. All of our segments can be seen on the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel. Since our launch in January of this year, we've expanded our global reach to over 54 countries with a social media following of over 125,000. Our commitment is to bring you the most in-depth interviews with authors, subject matter experts, and thought leaders from around the world. We have interviewed guests from Israel, Brazil, England, India, and all across North America. All of our authors are featured on the Books and Media page on our website, www.ianbn.com. There you can find a direct link to the book you want to order, and we receive a small commission directly from Amazon. There is no cost to you for this service. In addition to our daily teachings and interviews, we make available to you the archive of all of the interviews on our YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram channels. Our live program is available from our homepage, and there is never a charge to you for any of this access. We made the decision long ago that we would remain a commercial-free resource that would not be influenced by any pressure from any outside company. There are only two ways that we are able to continue to operate this ministry and provide you with the only live 4-hour daily Christian television talk show program. The first is through your support and tax-deductible contributions to Igniting a Nation. These can be made directly through the donate button on the website or sent through the mail to Igniting a Nation, 2700 Corporate Drive, Suite 120, Birmingham, Alabama, 35242. The other way we support the program is by offering you a unique opportunity to have access to over 10 years worth of teachings on a subscription basis. The teaching archives contains all of my prior sermons, Torah studies, prophecy in the news videos, and much more for the low subscription price of $5 per month. This subscription grants you unlimited access to over 800 hours of content not available elsewhere, and is updated weekly with the most current prophecy classes. In addition to 20 hours of original TV programming each weekday, we invite you to join us live every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings for our Prophecy in the News classes. The times and locations are listed on our events page on the website www.ianbn.com. Every day, you and I are faced with the challenge of where we will go to hear the truth. We are committed to bring you the only program of its kind that covers the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. We cannot do this without your support. Since we launched on January 5th, 2017, we have aired over 300 individual teachings, interviews, and commentaries not available anywhere else. We are now working side by side with almost every major Christian publishing house to bring you the most in-depth feature interviews possible. Our one-hour features address every subject that affects the believer's life. We are hearing of salvations from the Middle East, Africa, and all across the United States. Lives are being changed every day, and we have only just begun. Our mission is to become your trusted resource and grant you access to the people, tools, and information you need to grow in your relationship with the Lord. You can help us by liking us on social media and through your financial support. We know you have many choices in who you support, but we are prayerfully asking you to consider helping us keep revealing the truth, true to our calling, to cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth like no other program available. Donate today and help us bring the message to the four corners of the earth. Visit www.ianbn.com and donate, buy a book, or subscribe to our teaching archives. Without you, we do not exist. Jeff and Ben, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
Indeed.
What do you think the biggest stumbling block is for people sharing the gospel?
Well, I think one of them, I think, is connected to what you already said, and that is that they speak a message that hasn't necessarily transformed their life, or that they're not experiencing the ongoing transformation taking place in their life. Because I'm absolutely convinced people have no problem talking about what they love most, nor do they have any problem talking about what they believe most works, what most changes their life. So you'll never meet a person who has a hard time telling you what they care about if you give them the opportunity. And so I think at the heart of it is if they're not experiencing the ongoing power of the gospel transforming them, and their heart affections are not regularly being stirred up for who Jesus is and what he's done, that's going to be the fundamental problem for why they don't tend to speak about him. I think that's at the heart of it. I think clearly the other part is that we definitely live in a place where we're in the middle of spiritual warfare. The evil one puts all kinds of fear and insecurity in the minds of believers so that they're told, don't say this, people think you're stupid, nobody's going to respond, it doesn't work. Don't you believe that like nobody wants to listen to you anymore? And so you get these accusations and deceptions coming at you constantly, and we're not aware of the battle that is facing us, and so we give into it very easily because the fear of man at that point becomes so much more powerful than the fear of God for so many people. So those are some of the reasons I think.
So PC versus GC is right at the top of the list. Political correctness versus God correctness. Right? I think is one of the real big battles. I happen to talk to a lot of groups that don't really know the gospel. They know what the gospel is, but they don't know the gospel. And when I ask the question from 1 Peter 3:15 that says, give me the answer. Here's the question. Okay, give me the answer. What is the hope that burns within you? And they tell me the same thing every time I ask. Jesus died on the cross for my sins. And I say, time out. Hope is a future event. Hope can never be in the past. Hope is not what's been. Hope is always what is to come. So give me the big T. Don't tell me about 2,000-year-old history. What is the hope? Hope is always future tense. And they just look at me and they go, well, I've never thought about that. What is my hope? I said, your hope is that Jesus will return and that Jesus will fulfill the oldest prophecy in the Bible, that he will defeat Satan and that this garden experience will be returned to all who belong to him, and we will have this unity and this fellowship with God in the most provocative, the most extravagant kind of way. And I go, wow, that sounds really good. How do I get that? We're in a church. You get that through the gospel. You get that through, and as we're laughing, I'm not laughing at, I'm laughing with, because you and I both know that we've experienced this. We've seen it where they know the Bible stories, or they know about Jesus, and they think they're supposed to do more for him. And so they serve, and they do, and they do, and they do. They know nothing about doing more with him. Ben, has this been your experience as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think even the way that we have been taught, and if someone's been a believer for not very long or a long time, generally we've been taught a certain way to speak the gospel. And to your point, like, most of the culture around us, we've all talked about, we're saved at 40, truly saved, or 44, I guess you said, Eric, 21, 20. Most of us heard the gospel the entire life. Even before the broadcast, Eric, you were saying you heard that God created man and man sinned, and so we need Jesus so we can live with Jesus or live with God for all of eternity. This is kind of a common way that we're taught to speak the gospel.
Right.
But I think all three of us would say that never actually answered the questions we were asking. I don't know that any of us were saying, how can I live for eternity with God? I think in some way we were asking the same question that you posed to the church group, Eric, of saying, where is hope? Where is joy? Where is satisfaction? And I appreciate that you talked about the future hope we have. I think one of the things we try to do in the handbook, and that Jeff tried to do with Gospel Fluency, the book, was to say there is hope, and the hope is not just a future hope, as in an eternal future hope. That is our deepest place of hope. Right. But because of the gospel, we also have daily hope, and we also have hope for the different situations that every single one of us face. So that, to your point before the break, as we preach a sermon, as we talk about the gospel, maybe in a church gathering, we send folks back out to worship, not just in the church building, but to worship at school, to worship at work, and to see that the gospel truly does apply, not just to a past reality, to your point, also not just to a future reality, though, as in one day we'll get to be with God. Again, praise God, those are both true, but also I don't know that we've captured as a Christian culture the fact that the gospel truly does apply to our everyday hope. It's the hope of my parenting, it's the hope of my marriage, it's the hope of my relationships with non-believers, it's the hope of my wrestle with anger, it's the hope of everything.
You know, there's kind of a distinction between the hopes and the knows, the K-N-O-Ws. Okay? I know, because I'm a believer, I can go to God with whatever it is that I'm facing. I know that. Okay? I know that my salvation is secure. I know about covenant relations. I know that if God could break his covenant with Israel, he could break his covenant with me. So we must serve a covenant-keeping God, because he's made covenants 5,000 years ago that still stand to this very day. As you can see, a little country Israel surrounded by 56 Muslim nations, right, that are 5,000 times larger and stronger than they are, and all they can do is throw every now and then they can almost like toss a water balloon over a border. It's in one ways it's almost comical to watch how could it possibly be that the most oil-rich producing nations in the world, who are sworn enemies, can't figure out a way to get past the borders of a country that only has 8 million Jewish people? Half the Jewish population of the world lives there, and they're either well, there's no other explanation but the hand of God, protecting this little nation. Who did you write the handbook for? Who do you want to see? And I want to give what I think that an initial response might be. We're not trying to send out people with white shirts and black ties, carrying a briefcase, going 2 by 2, knocking on doors, carrying the Gospel Fluency handbook, and sitting down and explain. And you know the picture, okay? That's not the picture we're trying to paint here. All right, we're trying to equip the saints for the work of God, that everybody in everyday life can have a strong enough foundation to be able to speak the truth. Was that your vision in creating this?
Yeah. So when I wrote the Gospel Fluency book, my heart was to write it to normal, everyday people who somehow have been told that the only people who know how to actually share Jesus are the preacher on Sunday, the evangelist that you bring your friends to an event to hear, instead of normal, everyday people who learn how to speak the truths of the living hope that we have in Christ Jesus into normal, everyday stuff of life, like family brokenness, how I go to work, how I deal with worry and anxiety, how I parent my children, and all that. So I was writing it to normal, everyday people because I'm convinced that's God's call for the church, is to equip normal, everyday saints for the work of ministry. And that ministry, at the heart of it, has to have the gospel. And speaking the gospel, living in light of the gospel. And then Ben is really, really good at taking the things that I've written, and then us together being able to put that in a form where we can give people experiential training, where in groups they can begin to practice speaking these truths into everyday life. I think, like any language, the only way you really learn the language is not by just taking vocab and learning sentence structure. You actually have to immerse yourself into a people who know how to speak that language well and practice speaking it on a regular basis. And so Ben came alongside of me to develop the handbook so that we could provide a means by which people can experientially practice not only hearing the gospel and learning the gospel, but learning how to speak the gospel to one another in very practical ways.
You walk us through, Ben, how you set this up, because it's not a formula, it's an order.
Yeah.
There's an order to the flow of learn it, live it, apply it, or learn it, live it, share it, if you will.
Sure. Yeah.
So
I think that what we started with is kind of a basic understanding of what is the gospel. And so I love that you talked about, your own upbringing of growing up in a household with many languages. And the image of fluency ties obviously so closely to language. It's taking that idea of seeing the truths of God and seeing how it applies to all the everyday situations, and then learning over time as you become more and more comfortable with the, quote, language of the gospel, the truths of Jesus, the promises of Jesus, to not have to stop and translate and go, okay, here's how I see the situation. Let me put it through all my lenses, translate it, and then speak the gospel back out to it. But again, if we look at Spanish or French or any of the languages that you grew up with, Eric, at some point you don't have to even translate. You just see it, you know it as part of your heart language, and you're able to speak that out. And so what we tried to do with the handbook is start with some of those basics. We have to know the language we're speaking first. And so what is the gospel? What is the story of God? To your point before we started the broadcast, how is Jesus seen in even the types in the Old Testament. How is Jesus the true and better Ark of Noah? How is he the true and better Moses, the true and better rock of Abraham that gives living water, the true and better manna, and all of these kind of things? Do we know and do we see the objective truth of the gospel as we look back through the scriptures, and can we start to recognize that through our own experience? And then we kind of build it out through concentric circles, if I can say it like that. How do I learn to speak the gospel to myself in my own life and scenarios? How do I learn to share that with others? And then how do we together learn to take that gospel message out into the world, but in a way that is actually answering the questions that those around us are asking?
You know, Paul, in his letters, gave a lot of admonition. On one hand, it was kind of like getting beat with a mink whip. You know, I'm going to give you correction, but I'm going to try to make this as comfortable for you as possible. But I really need you to get this message and stop doing some of the things you're doing and really focus on what's really, really important. You have the book, The Gospel Fluency, then you have a video series, and now you have the Gospel Fluency Handbook. This sounds something that like churches need to embrace. The ones that have abandoned Wednesday night and gone to the exclusive small group model. I don't have anything against the small group model, but I'd like to see Wednesday night, a Wednesday night Bible study at church be one of the small group options, as opposed to, well, we don't do anything at the church all week long. We only do things there on Sunday. I'd kind of like to see us find a way to merge the models, and this seems like a perfect approach to bringing back, restoring the community, because where I'm weak, you're strong. Where I'm weak, he, of course, is strong. But in being able to work through some of these questions and hear some common misconceptions and misinterpretations, and why can't I reach this person? And you know, for me, they would invite me to church. All right, and they never realized, as most of the world doesn't, that there are two Jesuses. There's the Jesus of history, and there's the Jesus of the Bible. And the Jesus of history looks absolutely nothing like the Jesus of the Bible. The Crusades was the Jesus of history. The Spanish Inquisition is the Jesus of history. The Holocaust is the Jesus of history. It looks nothing like the Jesus of the Bible. So imagine every people group impacted by one of those three specifically named occurrences only know about the Jesus of history. For me as a Jew at 44, coming to know the Jesus of the Bible was an introduction to a concept that was actually consistent with Jewish thought. It was consistent with Jewish life. It was consistent with Jewish teaching, as opposed to it being Jesus was the God of the Gentiles, and I can't be a Gentile because I'm a Jew. And there's only two people in the Bible. In Ephesians 2, he says, just take the two and he'll make one. And it's that understanding of how to become fluent. You know, we work in an office building where some of the staff speaks different languages, and I speak a little smattering of some of those languages, and I introduce myself to them and tell them whenever I speak to them, I'm going to speak to them in their tongue because I want to become more fluent, and will they help me? And that's from the custodial to the construction to the groundskeeping to that staff, because I want to become more fluent. I need the practice. I need to talk to people that actually understand how to say what it is I'm trying to say. Isn't that the foundation, the principle behind what you're trying to accomplish here in Gospel Fluency? Is to be able to reach in the language, find that common language that was what was so powerful about Acts chapter 2, is that everybody heard them praying in their own language. They didn't hear it in a universal language. The Laodiceans heard it in Laodicea, and the Arabs heard it in Arabic, and the Spanish heard it in Spanish. It was in, and so to be fluent in the gospel, I also have to have a certain knowledge of my audience, don't I?
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually why one of the emphasis that we put in there is you've got to learn how to listen, and you got to listen to people's story, and you got to understand what their background is, what their hopes, what their longings, what their disappointments are, so that when we speak the good news of Jesus, we are speaking about something that actually makes sense to them, that we can speak it in their language, but not in any way shrink back from telling them the truth of Jesus Christ, all that he has done, all that he is doing, and all that he will do. And that's why I think one of the reasons why First Peter, we hear Peter say that we've been born into a living hope, that there's this, in the resurrection of Christ, we have a living hope that Jesus is presently actively working in this world through his people, looking forward to a future return where he'll make all things new, but presently at work in the world in the situations we face, so that we actually have good news to share to anybody, our neighbors, our coworkers, our family. We should be able to listen well, love well enough to actually know what good news will sound like when we share Jesus to them in a way that will really connect the dots for them in terms of their deep longings, disappointments, brokenness. He really is the answer to what they're looking for, but we got to listen well enough to know the questions that they're asking to actually know how to bring the hope in a way that makes sense.
You know, as you're saying that, all I can do is hear somebody saying, who's completely gospel illiterate, saying, I want to tell you the story about how a father killed his son.
Yeah.
Not going to be well received by the audience, not the headline you want to lead with. And I think it's incredibly important. You have created a tool that, and a lot of other aspects to it that make for, you say that this is an 8-week interactive handbook, step by step, certainly embracing the whole program. Imagine a congregation that actually says, we understand that God has instructed us for the equipping of the saints, and we actually have a program called the equipping of the saints, and here are the tools that we use for the equipping of the saints. So I commend you on making this practical, and that word practical is emphasized in here. This is not something where I have to go get my MDiv, I have to go get my PhD. This is the every man who wants to share the gospel, starting at home, which is the first ministry that every father or mother is called to, every husband and wife is called to, is the ministry at home. I guess the worst thing that could come out of this is that someone would have mastered a great deal of the Bible and shored up their own unbelief, which I think for Jeff, that was part of the answer to your call, is I believe, but forgive my unbelief. This has been one of the ways that you were able to play that out and turn something that was where you were weak, he made you strong. And that was by first confessing that.
Yeah, I actually start off the book talking about how I am still an unbeliever in that sense, and everyone is still an unbeliever because there's still aspects of their life where they live with unbelief. There's still aspects of their life where, if they were honest, they live a whole lot less like Jesus They live with fear and anxiety. They don't really believe the promises that we find in the gospel. And I think in a lot of ways, our sanctification, the process of becoming more like Jesus, is the ongoing process of moving from unbelief to belief, moving from not having faith in what God has done in Christ Jesus for us and will do, to moving towards faith in what he's done and will do. And so every single person I've ever met, if I am with them long enough, I will discover with them areas of unbelief in their life where they still struggle to believe that the gospel is sufficient for absolutely everything. And so, yeah, my own journey led me to realize, man, I can say I believe the gospel, but there's a lot of my life where it's evident I still haven't brought myself under submission to the realities and truths of Jesus Christ. And I'm still working through that on a daily basis.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us here. We've run out of time. And thank you for sharing Gospel Fluency Handbook, Gospel Fluency, the book, Gospel Fluency, the video series, Gospel Fluency, as well as Saturate, which is right here. Saturate can help. Don't go it alone. Sign up at saturatetheworld.com. Get resources, training, coaching, community assessments, and consulting available to you. So you're there beginning, middle, and end through people's journeys to help them along the way and help them grow, which we all need more of. Thank you so much for being with us here on Revealing the Truth. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.